Greetings, music nerds, and welcome to Season 8 of the Music Makers and Soul Shakers podcast. This season is brought to you by our newest sponsors, Larrivee Guitars and Fishman Amplification. I'm your host, Steve Dawson, coming to you from the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. This season, I'll be taking you on a journey down the many rabbit holes in the process of making great music. I'll be speaking to instrumentalists, songwriters, producers, up-and-comers through legendary veterans, and we'll go deep into their history and their process of creating unforgettable music. This show continues to be listener-supported. You can help keep the show going with a one-time donation or a Patreon subscription. And when you sign up for Patreon, you get an ad-free version of the show, as well as getting entered to win some killer prizes from our sponsors at the end of the season. We have an incredible Chase Bliss Lossy pedal up for grabs, as well as a Fishman acoustic guitar pickup and effects pedals, as well as a pedal from Union Tube and Transistor, and more. You can get links to all this and sign up now at makersandshakerspodcast.com. Meanwhile, many thanks to the sponsors for this season. Please check them out and let them know that I sent you. They are Larrivee Guitars, Fishman Pickups, Chase Bliss Pedals, Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and the Hen House Hang. All right, thanks for tuning in, and let's get down to it. Greetings, music nerds, and welcome to episode number 173 of the show. Today's guest is the great songwriter and blues guitarist and singer, Mr. Chris Smither. So the year is coming to a close. This is the final episode of 2024, but not the season. But here's what's going to happen is I'm going away in January. I've got a bunch of work early in the month, and then I'm going to Ireland to make a record in the middle of the month. So I just can't put episodes out during that time. So I'm going to just bump things over into February. So in February, we'll pick up the season and finish it off. There's going to be 2 episodes in February, and that's going to be it. Now, as you know, I've been telling you about the final draw we're going to do, and that's going to ramp up from now until the end of, or the middle of February, I guess, when the last episode comes out. And at that point, I'm going to be giving away 3 prizes to anybody that's signed up to the Patreon to help support the show and all the expenses that go along with having a show like this. So all you need to do is sign up for the Patreon. It's as little as a couple bucks a month. That really helps the cause for getting the show out there and hosted and promoted properly in the way that it has to be done. And for all those that have signed up already, I really appreciate you and thank you so much. For anyone on the fence, now is the time. You will be automatically entered into the draw, and there's going to be prizes from all our sponsors like Larrivee and Fishman Amplification and Chase Bliss and Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and my little wingding, the Hen House Hang. And the Hen House Hang, mixing with Steve, is the next event coming up in that world. That's going to be a 2-day mixing event here at the Hen House in Nashville. If you feel like coming and joining me and learning about mixing, that's going to be really fun. It happens in March, coming up in 2025. So there's going to be prizes given away to 3 people, just like we did last year. And thank you again for your support. And thanks again for tuning in this year. It's been an amazing year with some great guests, and I've had some really inspiring conversations, and glad you could listen and join me on that journey. Okay, so today's guest is Mr. Chris Smither. He is an incredible songwriter, a great singer, killer blues guitar player and performer. And I had the pleasure of meeting Chris and playing with him this past summer at a Vancouver Folk Festival. And man, it was really something else being on the stage with him. He had an incredible groove. I've seen him before, but being right beside him and playing together, there was a thing that was happening that was really interesting for me as a player to watch and experience. And he's just so dialed in between his foot stomping and his guitar playing and his lyrics and the way he sings, and the music just oozes out of him. So Chris grew up in New Orleans, but as you'll hear, he doesn't totally identify musically with his hometown. He's spent most of his career based out of the Massachusetts area, and that's where he developed his style and sound in those folk clubs of Boston and Cambridge in that area. And his songwriting style owes as much to others from that era and that scene as it does to blues songwriters like Lightnin Hopkins, Mississippi John Hurt, and Skip James. He manages to pull something off, which I think is really difficult and extremely unique, which is that he's developed a style of songwriting and performing that seems to be right out of that classic era of the blues folk tradition, but without being even the slightest bit derivative of those artists that came before him and inspired him. Chris wrote a couple songs that have become staples in Bonnie Raitt's career, like Love Me Like a Man and I Feel the Same. Not to mention Diana Krall also cutting Love Me Like a Man in more recent years. Chris's solo recording career began in 1971 with the album I'm a Stranger Too, which is really cool. You got to check that record out. It's aged really well. We talk about that record a little bit, and Chris hasn't heard it in a long time, and I encouraged him to go and check it out because it's actually a really cool record. It's a full band record, and over the years he's kind of developed into much more of a solo and small ensemble recorder. But back in those days, he was kind of being touted as like a folk rock pop kind of guy, and the records that he was putting out, the labels wanted him to be radio friendly, so they're more full band kinds of things. But that first record, I'm a Stranger Too, is really cool. And that came out on the Poppy label, at which time he was a label mate of Townes Van Zandt, interestingly. And he's been a really prolific artist ever since, with a few low times where he sort of shied away from making records. But since the 90s, pretty much, he's been really consistent with a new record every year or two. And his latest one is called All About the Bones, and it really is one of his best. You got to check that record out. It's amazing. And, Chris is just one of those rare artists that just seems to keep getting better, even into the age that he's at now. He still tours a lot and puts on an amazing show. And I hope we've got lots of Chris Smither records coming in the future. So I had a great conversation with him from his home on a rare break from the road. And we had a chance to dig into all this history and record making and songwriting. And it was just a great conversation. And you can keep up with Chris and all his latest news and extensive touring over at smither.com. And now, please enjoy my conversation with Chris Smither. Happy New Year. Happy holidays. We'll see you all in the new year in February. Thanks for listening. Enjoy. You mentioned growing up in New Orleans, and, that's a town that has a lot of depth to it and a lot of mystery and a lot of music. And I hear it in your music. I hear the influence of it. I hear I hear like Snooks Eaglin and people like that were, street players. And I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about growing up there. And I know like most of the things that I've heard you talk about in interviews are more from like your Boston era, but I don't think I've ever heard you really talk about the New Orleans part of your life. And I know you probably left there when you were pretty young, but can you maybe tell me a bit about how it was growing up there and what sort of impact you think it had on your music?
That's a question that I've gotten before, and I have a hard time. It's like you said, you can hear it, but it's not something that particularly stands out to me. Things, it's like the air you breathe, or it's not particularly notable to you. There's a certain rhythmic quality to it that I once was playing at a festival, and one of the guys from the Subdudes asked me where I was from, and I said New Orleans, and he said, I knew it. he said, I can hear it, but nobody ever bothers to tell me what it is that they hear, and
it's hard to put your finger on.
It is hard, There's a certain rhythmic quality to it that, I tap my feet backwards. Most people, I do a heel toe thing when I tap my foot, and that's the whole part of what I do. But, most people would tap the heel on the downbeat, and I tap the sole on the downbeat. It's like a backwards thing. And you hear that in New Orleans all the time. That
second line
backwards kind of thing. It just feels natural to me. But, I always felt out of place, to tell you the truth, in New Orleans. I felt like I was missing out on things, and the things that I was interested in weren't what was being played there. It was never, in spite of the fact that, you had people like Snooks Eaglin, but there weren't that many guitar players from New Orleans. It's mostly a keyboard and horn.
It's a horn town. Yeah.
Horn town and keyboards. It's kind of like Memphis in that way, although Memphis has more guitars. But and when I got into guitar, I got a guitar when I started playing a ukulele when I was 9, and then my dad got me a guitar. I think I was about 12 and I sort of translated to that, and it was a classical. And nobody could understand why I was playing the kind of music I was. All my friends would go, "What are you playing that old shit for?" And besides, why don't you have an electric guitar? If you're going to play the guitar, why don't you have an electric guitar? And it was just one of those things that everything that I listened to, everything that intrigued me was from other, from away. And so I wanted to get out.
So where were you hearing that stuff? Like, were you getting it on radio and stuff, or were your parents bringing home records for you and stuff?
Well, my parents had folk music records from the 40s, you know, and
okay.
30s and 40s. You know, they had Weavers and Burl Ives and, you know,
pre-folk revolution era.
Yes, exactly.
Where it's like pop music, basically.
And Josh White.
Oh, okay. That's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, that had a little bit of teeth. You know, I would sing Burl Ives songs all the time. I loved to sing. I always loved to sing. And then, you know, I was taught 3 chords on the ukulele by my uncle. I couldn't believe how easy that was, you know. He famously told me, he says, it is that easy. He said, if you know 3 chords, you can play almost any song you know. And if you know 4 chords, he says, you can rule the world.
He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Did you see a path from the ukulele to the guitar? Like, was that a thing where you were like, oh man, if I could just have a guitar, I could do all this other stuff? Or did you not really make that connection?
I didn't think about it that way. I just liked really playing the uke. And then, you know, we moved to Paris for a year, and my father was running all around Europe. I mean, the family was living in Paris, but my father was running to capitals all over. He had students that were studying abroad that year, and he'd go to supervise them. And he came back from Spain one time and said, here. You know,
and he just handed you a guitar? Oh, cool.
Handed me a guitar. And we'd left the ukulele at home. I can't remember what the rationale for that was, but I missed it desperately, you know. So, I don't think he'd ever seen me stick to anything for more than 2 weeks, and so he was impressed that I missed the ukulele, and he brought me a guitar.
Oh, that's cool. Like an acoustic, like a flat top acoustic.
Yeah, I've still got it. It's hanging on the wall in the other room over there. It's a wreck. I mean, you know, at some point I put steel strings on it and it just tore it apart. But I never let go of it. It's still there, you know, as a reminder of where it all started.
That's a cool thing to have, actually, because like most people don't actually have that first instrument.
I have a ukulele too.
Oh, you do?
Hanging right next to it.
Oh, cool.
Then that just took off. I got a book across the street someplace, you know. There was some little music shop in Paris across the street, and I got a chord book, you know, and started learning real chords and trying to handle 6 strings.
Did you have goals for yourself as a young kid playing guitar? Like, did you want to? I don't know what years that would have been, but were the Beatles out at that point, or?
Oh no! I'm really old. we're talking 1956.
All right, so pre-Beatles. You're
much pre-Beatles. It was Elvis though, and it was the Everly Brothers. You know, so and I remember realizing, you know, once I learned an A chord, a D chord, and an E chord that I could play, you know. Bye Bye Love.
That gets you pretty far in that world.
You know, and it's that was really what I wanted to play was pop music. I mean, the stuff that I was hearing on the radio, but I didn't know anything about music. I was always, you know, I was just totally self-taught. I didn't know anybody else that played the guitar or played music or played in a band or anything. I had no idea how anybody went about that. And when folk music came along, the big boom, it started with the Kingston Trio and then moved on. Then when Dylan and Baez were starting to be big things, I thought, okay, this is it, you know. And I found somebody that showed me. No, I'm sorry, I take it back. My freshman year of college, I went to Mexico City. And my roommate there liked listening to me play the guitar and sing these songs. He didn't know anything about them, and he said, "You should listen to this guy." And he gave me he had this an album, an LP, and it was Lightnin Hopkins.
Yeah. So you got into Lightnin Hopkins in Mexico?
In Mexico City.
Wow.
But my roommate in Mexico City was from Texas. He was from Bryan, Texas.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I said, "Who is this?" You know, and Lightnin Hopkins, and he put it on.
That would be a mind blower. Like that's
it was. I mean, it was a total mind blower because, I first he said, listen to this guy. And I said, which guy am I supposed to listen to? And he said, there's only one guy playing. It was kind of amazing because, I said, what is this? And he said, it's blues. This is blues. This is Texas blues. But that's not what I heard. I heard one man rock and roll. That's what I heard. This is exactly what I was trying to do, was make that kind of sound, that kind of music all by myself. And here was somebody that was doing it,
So had you never heard anything like that being in New Orleans? Like you didn't hear it on the radio or anything?
No, I didn't. I hadn't. I left New Orleans. I went back to New Orleans for my second year of school. I transferred back to Tulane, mainly because I wanted to go to Paris for my junior year, and I had to do my sophomore year at Tulane if I wanted to be on their abroad program.
What were you taking in college?
Anthropology.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. I was really interested in pre-Columbian Central America and southern Mexico.
You hadn't started playing professionally in any capacity at this point.
Not any capacity at all. And but by the time I got back from Mexico City, I was 18, I think, and the folk music and the songwriters were really starting to crop up. All these songwriters. Plus, there was a whole urban blues revival, and I realized that there were other people that were getting into this, like Lightnin Hopkins stuff that I didn't know anything about.
Yeah.
And so the next big discovery was a Vanguard record called The Blues at Newport, 1963.
Oh yeah, and that's got like Gary Davis on it, probably.
Gary Davis, Mississippi John Hurt, Skip James, Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, Johnny Hammond Jr.
Yeah.
And that led me to Van Ronk and all those cats that were, making the music up in New York and Boston.
Did you understand what was going on, like as far as John Hammond and Van Ronk were like the next generation? Not to mention they were white dudes in the middle of that, but did you hear them as like different from the earlier generation guys at all? Or like, did you realize?
I heard them as people who were actually doing what I was trying to do.
Yep.
Because everybody was, but if you think I was getting some grief before I had heard Lightnin Hopkins, when I came back to New Orleans trying to play Lightnin Hopkins, it was just like, it was absurd. People really laughed at it.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so it was like a big relief when I first heard Johnny Hammond. He was a guy who was only a couple of years older than me.
Yeah.
Doing exactly what I wanted to do.
And did you know that he was a couple years older? Like, did you know that he was what he was?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, I knew who he was. I knew who his father was. Not that it wasn't that important to me. I just realized that his father was some kind of bigwig, But
yeah,
it didn't matter to me because his father didn't play like that.
I'll say,
or sing like that. And it was remarkable. And so I sort of got into all the folk scene, and in those days, of course, it was hard to get the records, and I had to order them special, and I would.
Were you sitting down with records and like dropping the needle and like learning the licks note for note? You were doing it, yeah.
You got it, yeah. Trying to do that.
What were the big ones for you? That was probably Lightnin Hopkins, probably Brownie
Lightnin
McGee
Hopkins
was a big
and
one.
Mississippi John Hurt.
John Hurt.
Those two. John Hurt was. I sat there and listened to that sort of beautiful rolling syncopated style, and I thought, oh God, how does he do that? And then I found somebody who was an elementary finger picker. Mm-hmm. Who said, well, you just got to keep your thumb moving back and forth. And then
it's really
do
simple.
Something else. I'm basically really stumbling my way through it. I mean, there was no internet. There was nothing nobody knew anything.
Yeah, I guess there was no books either at that point about that style.
There were books, but they were like elementary. They didn't really focus on that kind of three-finger style or anything. Right. They were mostly just chord books, Melbourne instructional books.
Yeah, sort of a different planet. Yeah.
But I was getting there, and in a way it's kind of wonderful that I didn't know how it was done. because it led me
Right.
to experiment and try new techniques. And in a way, you try to fake it is what you wind up doing. But in your own way, you come up with something that's valid in its own right. And of course, in retrospect, I realized that's how those guys did it too.
Absolutely.
The originators, I was all into that scene, and I had a couple of friends who were also trying to play guitar. Most of them looked up to me. I mean, I was just not. I knew barely anything, and yet I was the big fish in the little pond as far as this, scene was, our personal little scene was concerned. But a friend of mine who lived in Sarasota, Florida, he said, "Hey, he said, Eric von Schmidt spends his winters in Sarasota. He's got a house in Sarasota. Why don't we go over there and see if we can meet him,
Had you heard of him before?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I'd heard of him from one thing on Dylan's first record. He said, "Here's a song I learned from Rick von Schmidt.
Yeah, totally.
Living in the green pastures of Harvard University." Rick's a blues guitar player. I remember that word for word.
He sort of drifted off into obscurity in the history perspective of things, but he was pretty well known and big at that point, right? Yeah,
very much so. Mm-hmm. He was a linchpin in the whole Club 47 scene. Okay. Which was the nucleus of the scene in Boston and Cambridge.
But you hadn't been there yet.
No. I was still in New Orleans. Okay. So we drove over to Sarasota, my friend and I. We drove over and we looked him up in the phone book and called him up.
That's cool.
He says, "Come on over." This is, we went over to his house. He met us nicely at the door, handed us a beer. "Come on in."
But is he a lot older than you, or was he like?
He's about 10 years older than me.
Okay.
Yeah. And older than most of the other guys in that Cambridge scene, too.
Right. Yeah, they were all kids at that point.
Oh, yeah. So I went in, and the whole house was full of people that I had seen on album covers that I had gotten from that I managed to acquire.
You mean just hanging out there at his house?
Just hanging out. Maria Muldaur was there with Jeffrey and Fritz Richmond, guys, all these people from the Jug Band. And I was just starstruck. And he said, "Come on in." And everybody was sitting around playing guitars. They're all swapping songs. And
that's actually pretty cool of him to be like,
"Hey, it was." And you lived right on the beach.
Kids.
I mean, you would not believe you couldn't afford to live there now. Yeah. And you might not want to, considering this hurricane that's coming in. Doubt. But he, he says, "Hey, play something," and so I played him some.
So where were you at, like musically, at this point? Were you?
I had written a couple of songs by this time. I had written a couple of songs, and I played one of them that I'd written, which was in fact kind of about that part of Florida, because I'd spent some time over there with this same friend that discovered that Von Schmidt was living in Sarasota. And so it was a song called Braden River, and they liked it a lot. And then I played some other stuff, we sort of kicked a song around, and he says, "Oh, you should," he says, "Where are you living?" And I said, "New Orleans." And he says, "Oh man, nobody's going to hear you there. You should come up to New York and Boston, where people are doing what you're doing, And to me, I'd been commanded, that was the word of the Lord.
So why was he in Florida then? If he was so,
he spent his winters in Florida.
Oh, he would go down there and just be there.
Yeah, all these people in that scene, most of them, I didn't realize this until much later, but most of them didn't really think of themselves as professional musicians. They all did other things. They were all in graduate school.
Yeah,
and Von Schmidt was a graphic artist, and a very, very good one, a very good painter. His father was an extremely good graphic artist who did, he was like on a level with, what's his name, Saturday Evening Post covers.
Like Norman Rockwell?
Norman Rockwell. He was like a Norman Rockwell guy, not as famous as Norman Rockwell, but he had tons of covers for the big weekly magazines and stuff. And,
oh, wow.
And Eric was following in that, and he was. So if you look back at that period in music, you'll see a lot of album covers that were done by Von Schmidt.
Really?
Yeah.
Like, do you know any offhand?
the blues workshop, the blues, what is that called? It was a whole collection of the urban blues revival that I think Elektra put out.
Okay.
And they did the cover of that. He did covers for Richard and Mimi Farina.
Oh yeah.
He did a cover for me.
That's so cool. I had no idea.
Yeah. Oh no, he was very well known. And then he spent the last part of his artistic career, before he died, he spent painting. He did one huge painting. I think it was about 16 feet wide by about 8 feet high. A picture, and it's a painting, a Western, of Custer's Last Stand, painted from the point of view of Custer. It's usually painted from the point of view of the Indians.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty well-known painting, and it's hanging, I think, in an art museum in Kansas or Missouri or someplace right in the middle of the country. Pretty well-known work, and he's very. It's surprising. I mean, he's much better known in that sort of art world than he is in music. But
that's crazy.
Still,
I just found out. Do you know who Sneaky Pete is?
That's a name I know, but I couldn't tell you much about him.
He was a pedal steel player in the Flying Burrito Brothers and stuff like that.
Flying Burrito Brothers, right?
I just found out he was one of the most famous stop motion animators of all time. Like he worked on all kinds of. He worked on the Terminator, like crazy stop motion stuff. Anyway. Sidetrack, but people do have day jobs.
Yeah, when I got up to Cambridge, I remember realizing that Von Schmidt, people like Von Schmidt and Jim Rooney and people like that who were at the heart and center of that scene, they were all kind of astonished that kids like me were showing up expecting to actually make a living.
Right, of course.
At this, because to them it was an avocation that occasionally, bought the extra tank of gas and
a couple beers maybe.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So did you just drop what you were doing in New Orleans and just go to Boston?
I did. I was my whole academic career was suffering as a result of playing too much guitar.
Yeah.
And I'd gotten into, I was obsessed with it. I used to go down there was a bar called the Dream Castle on Decatur Street, other side of Esplanade in New Orleans, and Babe Stovall played there all the time. And my friends and I used to go down and listen to him. We were the only white kids in the joint. Sit there and listen to him play that steel-bodied National. And
I don't know him. Was he a pretty straight-up blues player?
Babe Stovall, yeah, he was. Well, he was born on the Stovall Plantation, which is you're talking pretty deep blues.
Yeah, okay.
There. But yeah, he was a very New Orleans musician. I don't think he was originally from Mississippi, but he moved to New Orleans. I'm not sure exactly. He had a brief foray into the Northeast, trying to cash in on that urban blues revival, but it didn't take him very far. But there was one little coffee house in New Orleans too that I used to go down, and occasionally they'd get people in. I remember going down to hear a guy that everybody said, "Oh, this guy's really good." And I said, "What's his name?" And they said, "Jerry Ferris." So I went down and listened to Jerry Ferris, and I thought he was okay. I think he was too super or anything, but he was pretty good. And the next time I met him, his name was Jerry Jeff Walker, and I was opening for him.
Okay. Pretty good. So were you considering songwriting as a thing that you wanted to pursue at that point? Like, that's always been something really interesting to me about your career, is how you've you're clearly very influenced by the blues, but you never just do straight ahead blues stuff.
I was in the beginning, it was all exclusively blues. I'd written a few songs that were very derivative, but of bluesy stuff, But when I got up to Cambridge, and I just, at the end of my fourth year of college, I wasn't going to graduate, and it was questionable whether I would even be invited back. And, but I'd been told by Erich von Schmidt that I should go to Boston and New York. And so I did, and worked my way up along the East Coast. Took me about a month and a half to get there. And
were you just like hitchhiking and stuff, or did you have?
no, I'd met this woman who was also, she was like a folkie from the DC area.
Okay.
And she had a car, and she said, "Well, come on, I'll drive you." And we drove up, and we sort of visited some scenes that she knew about in DC. We stopped in Philly. We stopped in New York.
Yeah.
I was uncomfortable in New York. I mean, I knew I was getting close to the kind of scene I was looking for. But then when I got to Cambridge, and I was at home because I grew up on a college campus. I mean, my father was a university professor, for God's sake, and this was home.
So did you give New York a shot for a bit, or did you?
Yeah, I was there for about a month, and sleeping on people's couches and playing the basket houses.
Okay, so you were gigging around, and so at that point, was it mostly like a set of traditional blues tunes, or were you starting?
Yeah, it was. I'd written 2 or 3 songs myself, but mostly it was John Hurt, Lightnin Hopkins. Yeah. Secondhand Johnny Hammond stuff. And
did you meet John when you were there?
Not yet. Okay, that would come later.
Yeah,
but we're pretty good friends now. But it's
I just spent a day with him actually, not very long ago. Yeah,
he's a jet, isn't he?
He sure is. Yeah,
but I got to Cambridge, and it didn't take me long to realize that there was. Not only was there a lot of work to be had, there really was. There were a lot of places to play.
Like how many places?
10.
Really?
Yeah.
That's a lot.
All over Boston and Cambridge and in the suburbs, all over.
Yeah.
It was a big scene, and there were a lot of people playing it. But it didn't take me long to realize that doing covers wasn't going to cut it. I had to start trying to write songs.
What made you realize that? Just being around some great songwriters? Just
being around, that's where all the focus was. That's where the people who were getting the attention, that's what they were doing. The people were, the up and comers, and all the people that were playing what to us was the big time, that being the Club 47. That was the goal.
So that was the gold standard, was Club 47. And what was so great about that place? Was it bigger than the rest?
It was the place. It was where all the established performers. I mean, Dylan sang there, Baez sang there, Jim Queskin's Jug Band sang there, Tom Rush sang there. And they would get people like, you could go in there and for $2.50 hear Muddy Waters.
Oh, come on.
James Cotton.
Wow.
Tim Buckley. It was just astounding.
So who were the people that really inspired you at that time that were living there?
It wasn't so much that they inspired me musically. It's just that it was the professional level that they had reached that I was looking for. None of them did what I wanted to do.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Because what I wanted to do is what I've wound up doing, for all these years now. And none of them were really doing that. I didn't wake up to what songwriting could be really until I got into the two that really influenced me a lot were Paul Simon and Randy Newman.
Oh, Paul Simon, eh? I definitely hear the Randy Newman in you, and I know you've done a bunch of his songs over the years. So, but the Paul Simon thing, I didn't.
Paul Simon has a sensibility about the sound of words.
Yes, he sure does.
That is, it's just the way it rolls around in your mouth. I keep trying to explain this to people, but and musicians tend to understand it. Songwriters tend to understand it, but nobody else does. But you take a song like "The Boy in the Bubble." Mm-hmm. What does it mean? You don't care what it means. It just sounds good. Yeah. And besides, it's about everything, like if you actually sit down and listen to it, it's about everything in the world, but just the way the words roll out of your mouth, I was doing a recording once and this woman, Anita Suhannon, an absolutely wonderful musician, one of the best singers you ever heard. She said it was the first time that she'd worked with any of my stuff, and she was doing overdubs, harmonies, and she came out after finishing one. She said, these songs are the easiest songs to sing I ever heard. And I was so elated because here was somebody who could really sing, who was telling me that, yes, you've achieved that. I loved it. One of the nicest compliments I ever got. You know who was really, of that whole scene, there were a few people that came through that didn't stay long in that scene. They were mostly in New York, but they would spend time in Boston. Yep. But Loudon Wainwright.
Oh, yeah.
That was somebody I said, okay, now this guy's on to something. This guy's got his own thing,
And he was really injecting like humor in a different way than anybody else was also.
Yes, and there were no holds barred. I mean, he didn't have any restraint whatsoever.
Yeah.
Nothing was sacrosanct. Nothing.
I guess Randy Newman is kind of like that in that way too. Like,
very much so. Yeah.
Comedy and sarcasm gets into his lyrics,
and yet it never affects the desire to paint the picture.
Totally.
Paint the picture.
Yeah.
The picture is there, and it's just vivid. You can't miss it.
Yeah.
It's just so impressive.
Yeah. In those years in Boston, like you hadn't started making records yet, so you were gigging as much as you could, I guess, and playing. Like, were you making a living doing it, or were you having?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. I was doing quite well. Well, for the time, we're talking, middle '60s. I got to Cambridge in the '60s, or in 1966, and I didn't get to make a record until 1971. But by that time, I was pretty well known throughout the Northeast. I was playing a lot in Philadelphia. I was playing occasionally in New York. New York was like a kind of a nut to crack, but it was also, to me, very intimidating. I don't know why. It's just
it's an intimidating town.
Intimidating place.
Did you have somebody helping you with booking and stuff like that? Because it's kind of like most people would have had a record at that point. Yeah.
By this time, I was working with Von Schmidt had introduced me to Manny Greenhill, and Manny thought I was okay. He didn't work really hard for me. But at the same time, he was getting me gigs in D.C. He was getting me gigs in Philly, or his office was, not him personally. And he was kind of interested in watching, like what would happen. It was he was at a slight remove, it seemed to me, from a lot of things. I mean, he was managing Joan Baez, which took a lot of time, and a lot of other famous at that time folkies.
But that would have been a good feather in your cap to have somebody like that.
Oh, it was. It raised me a level.
Yeah.
Among my contemporaries and my peers. But
was he sending you out for like a couple weeks at a time, or was it just like a one-nighter in Philly? Come back?
In those days, no. In those days, one-nighters weren't so common.
Okay.
If you played the good clubs like the Main Point in Philadelphia, the Cellar Door in D.C., you were playing for 4 nights.
4 nights. Okay.
Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Yeah. 2 shows a night.
Okay.
Which was nice because, the first night the local newspaper would come and you'd get a review the next day. And then, if the review was good, you'd build up a following. And that was how I built up followings both in D.C. and in Philadelphia.
It really doesn't work like that anymore. It's so fascinating.
Nope. Nothing works the way it used to. And in some ways, that's very good.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's not so good at all.
Well, when you think about it, that's the way it should work. But I mean, nobody would take a chance on somebody that's unknown now and let them have a 4-night run at a club and just be like, okay, the first night, no one's going to be there, but they'll talk about it. That would never happen. Well,
but you didn't get the full night. You would go there as the opening act for somebody that did have a following, and that's how you picked it up. I mean, the people that I opened for. I would open for people like Dave Van Ronk. I opened for Joni Mitchell 4 nights I opened for Ian and Sylvia for 5 nights at the Cellar Door in D.C.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. I mean,
that's serious.
Get you going.
Yeah, no doubt. And then you'd go back and get your own night. Was that generally
you get your own night? And the people that said, "Hey, we discovered this guy, man. We went to hear Ian and Sylvia, and we heard this guy.
Sure.
Chris Miller, let's go see him." And they'd bring you along, and then Tom Zito in the Washington Post would give you a nice review, and things would progress from there.
Yeah. And then when you were back home, you were gigging around Boston and Cambridge a lot?
Yeah, I had a pretty good relationship with a guy that, well, there were 4 clubs on Charles Street alone at the foot of Beacon Hill.
Wow.
And I could play all of them.
Yeah.
And I would, and I'd play like every Thursday night at the Turk's Head and then the Sword and the Stone, the Loft, all these little places, coffee houses. And you'd make $15 a night, But this was 1970, and $15 was like about 100 today.
Yeah, yeah. And that was mostly like the tip jar or whatever, or is that the club paying?
No,
you?
That was what the house paid you.
Okay.
There was no tip jar.
No You must have been writing a lot more songs at that point too, right? Like had that sort of kicked into full gear?
I started getting really serious about writing songs, and I was making tapes and trying to send them to record companies. And by this time, I had met a guy in Philadelphia in the early 70s who was a DJ on the Penn radio station, University of Pennsylvania. At Penn.
Penn State
and that station was WXPN, which is a very big station these days. And his name was Michael Cascuna, and he was really had big ears for music of all kinds. He was really into jazz for a long time and had gotten tired with where jazz was going and was starting to get into these singer-songwriters. And so he was really interested in me. And he brought me a record at some point, I think about 1969, 1970, of Townes Van Zandt. And he said, look,
okay.
this guy's on Poppy Records. And if they're interested in him, I bet they're going to like you.
Had you heard of Townes before?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. But I listened to the record and I said, oh, you're probably right. Sounds like the right ballpark anyway, So
yeah, he was another big Lightnin Hopkins devotee too, and you probably heard that.
Oh, of course.
Like you had stuff in common. Yeah,
absolutely. And we became friends too because we turned into label mates, and that was my first label.
So you did get signed to Poppy.
I got signed to Poppy.
And what was that all about? Like, did they come out and see you, and was it a big thing, or was it just like a low key affair?
I sent him a tape. I sent him a reel-to-reel tape.
Really? Cool.
7 songs.
Yeah.
7 songs, and I think about a week later, I was playing at the Turk's Head on Charles Street in Boston, and 2 guys came in, and they were introduced themselves to me. And I had a friend of mine, John Bailey. He was playing second guitar with me. We used to do this duet kind of thing. And he had been on the tape that I sent to Poppy too. So these 2 guys from RCA said, "We're from RCA Records, and Kevin Eggers from Poppy asked us to stop by and see if you actually did what's on the tape."
Oh, really? And had you been doing it?
I did. Okay. I had. I said, we're happy to tell you that we will report back that you sound just like the tape. And that was it. I signed with them.
Tell me about that tape. Like, where did you make your first recording?
I made it on a Canberg reel-to-reel tape recorder in my living room.
Wicked.
I had a couple of, what were those microphones? I can't remember. They look like chrome ice cream cones, I remember.
Did you own that stuff, or did somebody lend it to you? Or?
I owned it.
Okay.
Yeah, I owned it. I saved all my pennies, to get some recording material.
So that was the point, was to get like a reel-to-reel that you could make a recording with.
Make a decent recording on that you could then send around. And
that's cool.
And that was the whole point of life in those days, was to get a deal. You had to get a deal.
Yeah, yeah. And so for someone like you that was doing essentially solo or maybe at the most duo stuff, were they saying like, okay, come to New York, make a record, we'll pay for it? Like, what was the actual setup to make your first record?
They did. I went to New York, and and of course, Michael Cascuna. See, it's interesting. I never got to finish talking about Michael. And I don't know if you know who Michael Cascuna was.
I know he produced your first records, right?
He produced my first records. He not only did that, but he founded a jazz reissue label called Mosaic. And he died very recently. He had a very, very extensive obituary in the Times, and he was quite the figure, and it turned into that. But he was the one that got me my first deal, he was a total unknown. Poppy Records did not want him producing my record. He wanted to produce it desperately, but he wound up getting to co-produce it. But they assigned a producer to me. I think his name was Ron Frangipane.
Okay.
I think that's the last time I ever saw him. But we went into RCA Studios, Studio A. It was a big.
And that was right in Manhattan. Like, I don't even know where that was.
Right in Manhattan.
Right in the shit.
John, my pal John Bailey, me, and then I can't remember who the drummer was, but he was somebody adequate, and a bass player that nobody liked.
Really?
And Michael kept saying to Ron, will you just call up Richard Davis and get him over here? He'll get over. He'll be here in an hour, and he'll make everything right. And finally, Ron said, "Okay," and they called up. They called up.
The first guy got fired.
Richard Davis, the Richard Davis.
Yeah,
mind you. And Richard Davis came over. So now, man, we're in the big time now. I didn't know anything about Richard Davis except that he was a name. He was a very big name in jazz, and it really did make everything. I could tell you a nice story about Richard Davis. You want to hear it?
I do.
So we're working on these little tunes, and at some point we took a break, and Richard comes over to me and he says, "I wonder if you could help me with something." And I said, "Well, I can try." And he says, "There's this little coda in this song that we're working on, and your buddy over here, he seems to have it down, but I can't quite catch what's going on in that thing. Could you just show it to me?" And I was sort of really reluctant to admit that I didn't know what a coda was.
Okay.
But I had sort of pieced together what part he was talking about, So but I prefaced trying to help him out by saying, "Well, I can try to show you what's going on, but it might be hard for me because I don't really know much about music." And he got this big look of shock on his face, and he says, "Don't say that. You know a great deal about music."
Oh man!
Says, you just don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
It was the most comforting thing that anybody had ever said to me. It was the most reassuring. I mean, and later I found out. I told that story to somebody who knew him well and said, "That's Richard. Mm-hmm. That's just the way he was." And you can talk to his students. You can talk to the people he played with. He was always like that.
How old would he have been at that time?
I would have been 26 or 7, so he probably was in his middle 30s.
Okay, so not that much older. He wasn't like an old dude at that point. Okay,
but he was a name.
Yeah. What was the process like of? I didn't realize that you'd never played with those guys on the first record, because it is kind of a band record, that first album. Was that like? Did it come together quickly?
4 days.
Okay. Did it feel good really quickly once he showed up?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It did.
So the process itself wasn't super painful or anything. It
wasn't. I mean, John Bailey and I were rehearsed like crazy. I mean, we knew these songs backwards and forwards, and it was great. And it was just a question of learning. I had never played with a rhythm section, but I fell into it pretty quickly, and it was a little bit hard. That was the first time that I ran into the problem of my feet, because I cannot quit tapping my feet.
Okay.
They kept trying to tell me, "Don't tap your feet. You don't need to tap your feet. You got a drummer. You got a bass player." Yeah. And I never have quit tapping my feet. And finally, everybody just gave up. I just keep it up now.
It's funny that they wouldn't have embraced it though and like worked it in. So did they end up like putting towels under your feet or something to like make it?
Yeah, they boxed them. They boxed them. Essentially, I could tap my feet, but it was within a box.
Okay.
Had rugs and towels over it and stuff. I have to feel it. it.
Oh yeah. What was the song selection process like? Because there's I guess it's mostly originals, but there's a Randy Newman or two.
There is a Randy Newman song, and there's I forget. Gosh.
I mean, it almost sounds like they wanted you to be in the Gordon Lightfoot camp of like sort of folk pop at that point.
I don't think they had a preconceived notion. They wanted me to sound like Chris Smith, but with a band. You just weren't going to get any radio play if there wasn't drums.
So that was the thing. It was like it has to have a band because it's got to
have a band because you got to get radio play.
Okay. Okay.
That was it. I was enormously proud of it.
It's a cool record. It stands up too. It's a good sounding record. I just listened to it yesterday, and man.
Well, thank you. I have to confess, it's been years and years since I listened to it.
Well, I don't blame you. I think you've earned the right to go back and listen to it now, and you'll be like, that's a good record, man.
You've piqued my curiosity, so I will make the effort. Sure.
And so, what was the scene with Poppy Records like? Were they a really proactive label that supported you and
they did. The record business being what it is, I don't suppose they were any worse than anybody else, but they certainly weren't any better.
Yeah.
They were manipulative. They were deceptive.
Okay.
They took half of my publishing.
Yeah.
Because that was just what they did in those days,
Yeah.
They said, well, you're entering a publishing deal, you're entering a recording deal, but you're also entering a publishing deal, and you don't know any better than to say yes or no.
Yeah.
Because you want desperately to make the record, and the only way you were going to get to make a record was to sign with a record company.
Yeah.
And everybody at that time did exactly the same thing. So tunes like, probably the song that makes me the most money in the world is Love You Like a Man. And that's now owned by, half of that is owned by EMI.
Still to this day?
To this day.
Yeah. Oh my God. You can't get that back?
You know what? It still makes me a lot of money.
Yeah. So no
I'm not going to
complaints.
cry about it at this point.
Oh, that's good, man. And you stuck with them for 2 records, or was it more?
3. Actually 2 records. I made 2 records for them, and they released those. And
so Don't It Drag On came in 72, right?
That was the second album.
Okay.
Yeah, Don't It Drag On. That was the second album. And then I made a third one right in the middle of sort of trying to get together for the third album. Poppy was acquired by United Artists.
Okay.
And
is it that old story where like the people that were supporting you kind of vanished and?
Yep.
Okay. Man, I was talking to John Hammond about his whole career is based around like that happening over and over and over and over
again. Yeah. Right. So all the people that were in your camp, suddenly didn't have a job, and so neither did you.
Oh my God.
But no, I made that record, and that was a very difficult record because I was having a terrible time writing songs, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was getting so far into alcohol at the time.
Oh yeah,
it was just really just kind of destroying me.
Was that brought on just by being on the road and that whole thing, or
I don't know what causes alcoholism? Most people tell you it's because you drink.
But was it getting worse the more you were on the road?
It was just getting worse, period.
Okay.
It didn't matter whether I was on the road or not. It was just one of these things.
Yeah. So it was kind of blocking your creative process then?
Oh, yeah. It was screwing up my whole life,
Mm-hmm.
And so, at any rate, United Artists gets this album, and basically when they acquired a lot of record companies at that time, little ones, and they basically just, took a machete through the list. And it just dropped everybody,
See you later.
That record never came out. It did finally come out like 30 years later.
So this is Honeysuckle Dog you're talking about.
Honeysuckle Dog.
Okay, so I can't find that record. It's not on digital streaming. It's not.
Makes me happy.
It's not. Oh, really? Because I'm curious about it.
It makes me happy that you can't find it. I don't like it.
I'm curious about it because when I read about it, it said Lowell George is on it and Dr. John is on it. So what's that all about? Were they just pals that you started running into?
Yeah, I mean they were pals, and Michael Cascuna was producing at this point, totally, solo. He produced the second one too, and he was producing this one, And he was also producing Bonnie Raitt's first record, and
oh yeah, that's where I know his name from. Also,
yeah, and Bonnie was hanging out with Lowell and Little Feat and all these cats, you know. And I had met Dr. John at some point. I forget, because we had the New Orleans connection.
Yeah,
and you know, they just came in and played. You know, it was Michael called them up. They'd be in town. He'd say, "Come on over, play. I got this session going. Come on over. I want you to play guitar on this." And they would just come.
Cool. I got to hear that. I mean,
there are things wrong with it, but there are things right with it as well.
So that record never came out. You got dropped, and that was basically the end of that chapter. Oh wow. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah. So Bonnie Raitt, was she sort of like in the same scene in Boston, Cambridge as you, or not?
Yeah, you know, it was an interesting thing, because one of the things that all of us guys that were, especially the guys that were into blues, what we liked to do was go over to Dick Waterman's house in Cambridge, because you never knew who was going to be in Dick Waterman's living room.
And they were a couple, right?
And there was always this redheaded girlfriend hanging around. That was Bonnie.
Okay.
I'm embarrassed to tell you how long I knew her before I knew that she even played the guitar.
Really?
Yeah.
So she was just hanging out. You had no clue that she.
Yeah, well, she was. I mean, you'd go over to Dick's house, and Son would be over. Son House would be sitting in the living room, and drinking with Skip James, and and they'd be playing this stuff, and we'd all be sitting around just watching them, and Bonnie would run into the kitchen to put the coffee on or something, something like. I mean, we didn't know. Yeah. I mean, you're standing there with the guys that invented it.
Yeah.
and you don't really appreciate until you're my age now exactly what you were standing next to.
Tell me a bit about who was around that like Dick Waterman's house, like Son House. Who else did you see there?
Booker.
Man.
Booker White, and now, see, I get things confused too, because I was going to say Reverend Gary Davis, but Reverend Gary Davis used to stay at other people's houses. You would see him because he would play the 47.
Okay.
And he'd be staying with somebody, but all those guys stayed at people's houses. They didn't stay in hotels.
Interesting.
People would put them up.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you specifically learn guitar things from those people, or were you just like watching? Or what was the scene?
I was just sort of being in the presence.
Mm-hmm. Did you have much interaction with them?
Well, conversationally, yeah. Yes. They were without exception the nicest, most gentlemanly people. They really, you could ask them anything. They'd say, "Oh, well, it's just this." You'd ask them how to do a certain thing, and it would be explained in non-musical terms, because none of them were particularly well educated musically they were all playing self-taught stuff, or stuff that they had learned, but there was none of there are stories that go around about them being sort of secretive and unwilling to share what they do, but that wasn't the case at all.
Okay.
No.
And did they generally think it was cool that there was a bunch of kids there that thought they were awesome?
Yeah. Oh yes. Especially since you'd buy them whiskey.
Yeah, I've heard that, like Gary Davis would sort of like adopt a certain person and would show them some guitar stuff, and then in return, that person would drive them around and buy them booze.
Oh yeah, I mean that was part of the deal. You were the lead boy for a blind musician, and in return you got to learn. And he taught. I mean, he actually gave lessons out of his apartment in New York.
Yeah, Jorma, I think, took like quite a few actual guitar lessons from him, right?
Yes, he did, and he took lessons from him, and so did Roy Bookbinder.
And,
Book spent years with Gary. I mean, he drove him around. He was the lead boy for a long time.
Oh, that's crazy. Did you meet Mississippi John Hurt ever?
Twice.
Do tell.
This goes back to before I even got up to Cambridge, because, when I finished my second year of college, and then my junior year, I was going to Paris for a year.
Yeah.
And this friend of mine lived in New York. He actually lived in Yonkers, just outside the city. And he said, "Have you ever been to New York?" And I said, "No." And he says, "Well, but I was sailing from New York. In those days, you took a ship, if you were going to go for a long time."
Okay.
And so I was coming to New York to catch. I remember I went over on the SS United States. He says, "Well, come on, come a couple of days early, and I'll show you around the city, And I said, "Oh, maybe we could see some music, because I knew that there was all this stuff that I was interested in going on." And so I got to New York, and he met me. I forget how we actually hooked up, but I got to his house, and he says, "Well, I got the Voice here," and he opens up the newspaper, and he's reading what's going on down in the village, and he says, "Gaslight Cafe." And I said, "Oh, I've heard of that. Who's playing at the Gaslight?" And he says, "Mississippi, John Hurt." And I said, "You are, we gotta go. Come on. This is unbelievable." I couldn't believe my good fortune, So we got on the train and we went into town and got into the Gaslight. And there weren't that many people there. I mean, there was, 20 or 30,
No kidding.
at tops. But I got a good table right up in front,
What year would this have been roughly? Like early?
This would have been 1964. And so I'm sitting right up in front at the Gaslight. And I'd never been in a place like this, really. I mean, like a New York, sort of coffee house. And this kid comes out on stage, in a Madras shirt with a big gilt guitar, white kid. Didn't look like John Hurt to me. We started singing these songs. I didn't know anything about opening acts or anything. But that's what it was. So I'm listening to this guy. He's all right. But there was this really hip guy sitting right next to me at a table, all dressed in black, and he looked very hip. And so I just said, "Who's this? Who's this guy?" And he looks at me like this. "You shouldn't be. You don't know who that is." I said, "No, who is it?" And he says, "That's Tom Paxton."
Oh, okay.
I said, "What do I know from Tom Paxton?" Nothing. Okay, Tom Paxton.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here listening to like his set. And in the middle of his set, out from the back, walking past the stage on the right-hand side, coming back from backstage someplace, comes my hero, John Hurt himself. Totally recognizable. And he sits down at my table right behind me.
At your table?
At my table,
Whoa.
Yeah. He just sits there like listening to Tom Paxton. So I turned around. I was going to say something to him, and he shushed me. And he pointed to the stage. Don't say anything. So, 50 years later, I tell Tom, I said, I just wanted you to know that in 1964, the Mississippi John Hurt shushed me in favor of you. And he looked at me and said, "Damn straight. I hope you took it to heart."
Was that your only interaction with him, getting shushed?
No, that wasn't. I met him again much later when he was playing not much later. It was only a year or two later when he was playing the Jazz Workshop in Boston. But later on in the set, when John Hurt started to play, and I was in heaven, I'm sitting there. I listened after about 4 songs. This other kid comes up on stage and starts playing a harmonica with him, which really irritated me because I wasn't that good at separating. I wanted to hear the guitar playing. And it was confusing to me. But everybody seemed to be happy about it except me. So I turned to this hipster again. And I said, "Who's that playing the harmonica?" And he gives me the same look. Like, "I can't believe you don't know who that is." And I said, "Who is it?" And he says, "John Sebastian."
Oh, really?
I said, "Okay, John Sebastian." And then, of course, the next time I heard John Sebastian, he was playing, "Hot Town, Summer in the City, Bang of my neck, getting dirty and gritty." And so, just last year, I told that story to John, and we were backstage. It was a few months before Happy Charm got sick.
Yeah,
and Happy was putting on this show in Woodstock, and he had me come over to do a few songs, and John was playing with him, and Cindy Cash Dollar and some other people, And I was talking to John, and I said, I don't think I ever told you the story about it when you were playing. I saw you in 1964 playing harmonica with Mississippi John Hurt at the Gaslight, and he grabs me. John grabs me and stands me up and says, "I got a witness! I got a witness!"
Did you tell him you actually didn't want him to be playing?
Yeah, I told him the whole story. Yeah, you have to.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, it's tricky with meeting your heroes sometimes, I find, or for me, it has been historically, I would say that it's not always what it's cracked up to be, but it sounds like you had some pretty great experiences.
Well, I just loved being just next to him.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't care that he shushed me. I had a story to tell.
Did you ever meet Lightnin Hopkins?
Never did. Never even laid eyes on him in person, that's kind of a big regret for me. He spent a lot of time on the West Coast. He would go out to the West Coast, but he didn't come east much.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
And he was probably living in Texas still, or was he living out
He was
west?
living in Texas, but he would go to L.A., and Townes at least told me that he did. And I think I've seen posters of him playing at the Troubadour and places like that in the Ash Grove.
Yeah. So did recording for Poppy, did that lead you to have a relationship with Townes over the years? Like, I don't know if you guys...
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we became friends. Yeah. Not close. I mean, I was living in Massachusetts. He was living in Texas, but we did several shows together. We did a week together at a club in Coral Gables. I remember that.
Oh man, that would have been really cool to see you and Townes.
There's a lot of stories involved with that too.
Tell me one.
We came back from the club one night, both of us, drunk as skunks, and with a couple of women in tow, and nobody was in this hotel except us, and we were the only people staying in this motel. It was really strange. And we all said, "Let's go swimming," and we all, we were all naked, swimming, splashing around in the pool, and in the middle of these shenanigans, Townes climbs up there was a slide at the shallow end of the pool, and he gets up on the top of this slide. He says, "I'm gonna ski down," and he goes skiing down the slide. And he made it all the way to the bottom without falling over, but his feet went out from under him and his hand hit on the back of the slide, on the edge of the slide, and he hit the water like dead meat. It was just, I never swam so fast in my life. I got down there and I hauled him out, and pumped him out, and I kept looking for blood on his head, but he didn't cut himself or anything, but he sort of knocked himself out, He came to, and
so he could have drowned.
He looks up at me. Yeah, he looks up at me and he says, "Chris," he says, "you saved my life." And from then on, we would meet at festivals. I don't know where. We'd run into each other. And it didn't matter who he was with. He would turn to me and say, "I want you to meet Chris Smither. He saved my life."
Oh my God, that's awesome. I have a similar experience with John Renbourn. You probably know John Renbourn, right?
I do know John. Yeah, I did know John. Yes.
So John and I were both teaching guitar at Bob Brosman's guitar camp. It was called International Guitar Seminar. And Bob and Woody Mann were putting it on in Vancouver.
Okay.
This is like in 2002 or something.
That's your hometown, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and so we were staying, and the camp was put on at Gage Towers, which is the place that you probably stayed at this summer when you played the Folk Fest.
It is exactly where I stayed.
So in that building was the thing, and it's like, I don't know which building you're in, but the big one is like 20 or maybe 18 stories, something like that. It's sort of a big tower thing, and we're hanging out there. It's like 3 a.m. or something, because those jams would sort of go all night. And Renbourn and I were hanging out on a balcony on one of those things, and he'd been drinking for like all night kind of thing. And we were talking, and he was like you could see his eyes drooping or whatever. And he kind of like passed out on his feet, and he was going over the balcony, and I grabbed him. And I pulled him. He was a big dude, and it took me. It took all my strength, but I pulled him back in. And I don't know if he ever even was aware of the fact that he was going over the edge, but he was going over, and I saved his life. And I gave him another few years, But I don't think he was aware of it as like Townes was with you.
Yeah. Well,
Speaking of Vancouver, when I was on stage with you, one of the things that I noticed about the way that you perform is like you kind of go into this trance-like vibe that's going on with your, it's like coming through your body, it's going into your foot, it's going onto the stage that way. There's like this thing, sort of hypnotic playing. I don't know, like how much of what you do when you play live is improvised? How structured is guitar-wise? How structured is that? What you're doing, what's going on? Like, is it changing from night to night? Are you freely improvising part of it?
I don't freely improvise much. It does happen,
yeah,
but not a lot. It depends on the night. There are some nights when I just feel like, I could do anything, and I do, but I'm not that kind of a player. It's one of the things I admire about players like yourself, is that you seem to be able to do that within. I'm better at it now than I was. Mm-hmm. Mostly just, from hanging out with David Goodrich, my producer, who gives me, he's an unbelievably talented musician, but he's also schooled. Mm-hmm. And so he knows. He told me once, he said, learn some scales, Chris, and it'll improve your playing. And he said, play me. I remember once he said, play me a major scale. And so I played him a major scale. And he said, now play me a minor scale. And I played it for him, but I couldn't rip it off the way I could a major. And he says, just get as facile with that as you are with the major scale, and you'll make a big difference. You'll see. And he was right, Yeah. But at the same time, within certain limits, I do improvise. It does change, but it's not a freewheeling thing at all.
Okay.
I'm trying to hold it all together. There's three things going on at once, and I'm trying to hold it all together. And when I'm at my best, I feel like, as you just sort of intimated, that I'm locked into a trance almost. I once had a shrink tell me afterwards that she was amazed to watch me. She says, it looks like you dissociate as soon as the song starts. And then when it's over, you come back.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And I think that's pretty true. It's just and if I can't do that, the playing becomes forced. Uh-huh. And people who know, who are very familiar with me will hear it. They'll say, "Oh, he's not really on. It doesn't sound the way it would normally sound."
Yeah. Tell me about your writing, like for the new record, All About the Bones. Mm-hmm. Do you road test stuff and like play tunes for years, or do you sit down and are you like, I got to make a record, and then you write a bunch of tunes? Like, how does that work for you?
These days, it's more like I got to make a record. I got to write some tunes.
Okay.
It really is. In my ideal world, when I was younger, I would road test the songs extensively, and I had the time and the luxury to do it, because there didn't seem to be that much pressure. I didn't put that much pressure on myself. But I think probably, over the last 20 years, which have actually been the most productive of my whole life, it's been a question of, whoops, time to make a new record. I do not write constantly at all. And it's time to make a new record. And it's always very stressful to start writing because I haven't been doing it. It's not like, and it's like the muscles are out of tone. They're not in tone.
Even if you've been touring and playing a ton.
Yeah, because you're playing the old stuff, and so you're stuck in those ruts, and you're looking for something new, and you're trying to find something. But experience has taught me that if I persist, and it takes discipline, I have to actually go into my music room and sit there and work at it, and I've become, I just have faith that it's going to happen because it has happened every time before.
Do you kind of schedule time off to do that, or are you just okay?
Yeah. I got to get out and play sometimes because you start to lose your jobs if you're not out in front of people and so forth, and things start to get stiff. But for the most part, I need I need time to sit there and say every day, 9:00, I'm going to be in that room. I'm going to be sitting there doing this.
So it's structured that way.
This last record, it wouldn't happen for me. It was very stressful in a kind of a new way. I had guitar ideas. I had progressions. I had, melodic ideas and so forth. But the lyrics, which to me are the heart and soul of everything, wasn't happening. And I had told Goody, my producer, I said, okay, I think I'll be ready to record by June, meaning of 23, 2023. And June came around and I had one song.
Wow.
and I'd given myself like 9 months, which is a nice gestation period. And he calls me up and he says,
time to go.
You getting worried? I said, yeah, I am. He says, me too. And he said, I'm coming up. I'm going to come up. He lives in Texas, in Austin. He said, I'm going to come up. And he came up, he flew up, and we've been working together for like 25 years.
Yeah, you've used him for everything in the last couple decades. Yeah.
And it's turned into a really wonderful relationship, and he's a catalyst for me. And everybody needs somebody like that.
So what does he do to like kick your ass into
writing? I don't know. He walks in, Steve. He walks into the room and everything changes.
Really?
Yeah. He just. I'm sitting in the room where we worked. Yeah. Right now, he came in the door. He said, okay, well, I met him downstairs and we were drinking some coffee at first, and he says, okay, let's go upstairs. So we went up to my music room here. We picked up a couple guitars, and he just started riffing, he started playing that bass line, boom, 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 boom. That's something that he has heard me do for years. Mm-hmm. It's just something I do when I pick up the guitar. And he was just playing something familiar. So I joined in, we started bouncing off each other. We never modulated. We just stayed in the one, just boom, do. And it was cooking along pretty good, And he looks at me and he says, sing something. That's all he did. He just said, sing something. And I said, it's all about the bones, boom.
Yeah.
All about the bones. And he stops and he says, write that down. And then it's just, it's hard to explain, but, something like that just opens a door.
That's sort of a theme that like comes up on the record too, is like that song is sort of about like encountering death or the Grim Reaper or whatever, I guess. And that's something that's, that runs through Skip James's music too. And it runs through Lightnin Hopkins. And I hear that in what you're doing, but it doesn't sound derivative at all, which I think is really hard to do. And you do it better than anybody, I think.
Thank you very much. It was just such and we have conversations too. He's a wonderful talker, and he's married to a wonderful poet, and it's there's a lot going on in our relationship that doesn't necessarily have to do with like playing the guitar and singing the songs, and. You made me think of it when you were just saying that, because we talked a lot about what kinds of songs should come out of this session, and I'm coming up on 80 in a month. Wow. I'll be 80. And he said, there's a certain bunch of things that it's appropriate to think about at this point. Yeah. And that was, that had to do with, just saying that it's all about the bones, and In the Bardo is another song,
Yeah, tell me about that one. I don't know what that word is even. Is that
the Bardo? The Bardo is a concept that's comes from some Eastern traditions, principally Tibetan Buddhism, but it is a liminal space without definition, foggy, between death and rebirth.
Whoa. Okay.
So think about limbo. But a dissociative limbo where everything gets entropy takes over and everything breaks down and then reforms into the next cycle.
I can't believe no one has written songs about that before that I know of.
I think they have.
Yeah, they just don't know it.
I don't know them, but you know what? What happened was that I sat down, and once I start writing, and of course, once I had these sessions with Goody, things started happening pretty quick.
Okay, so the floodgates kind of opened.
It was it's like he broke apart some ice jam or something, you know, and all this stuff started flooding out.
Wow.
And I was having a hard time keeping up, but that's one of the most exhilarating parts of songwriting for me, is when it happens so fast that you don't have time to even think about what it means. So I was, you know, and often in the past I write a song and I'm not even sure what it's about until it's half done. And then I get to a point where it opens itself and I go, and I've said this 100 times, I'll bet, but you know, writing songs for me and for many songwriters that I've talked to is like having a conversation with a part of your brain that you're not really on speaking terms with at all. And so
that.
You have to sort of dance around each other because you don't want to scare each other off, you know. You know you've got to get something done together, but it's not comfortable.
Yeah.
All right. And then I get to a point where I look at what's being scribbled down and I say, okay, I think I see what he's driving at, you know, and then,
so there's sort of an initial stream of consciousness.
Yeah.
And then you get to
call it that, you know, or it's just, you know, it's sort of like Cliff Eberhard used to say, it's like, I'm not paying attention to you. It's a conscious, disavowal of interest. And so, and this time for that song in the Bardo, I had basically finished the song and I still didn't know what it was about.
Oh, wow.
I looked at it, you know. Now, George Saunders wrote an experimental novel a few years ago called Lincoln in the Bardo. And it's a very spooky book. I recommend it to you.
All right. But
it's quite interesting. And so I'm looking at this song and I'm thinking, well, I think I'll just call this Smither in the Bardo.
Cool. Okay.
And as soon as I had that thought, I thought to myself, oh, wait, that's what it is. It's the Bardo.
Oh, man, that is wicked.
And
nice.
So as soon as I had that thought, then I could organize it a little more tightly and turn it into what it is now. And that's how that came about. And then, you know, so then Goody and I will have conversations about all sorts of things, you know, like end of times, or this the end of your times, and how do you know when something's done? You know, and that comes to that's what the song Completion is about as well.
And did you make the record there in your house, or did you go into a studio?
No, we did it at Sonolab. There's a studio in East Hampton, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay. Was all the percussion, and there's a really cool sax player on the record. Was that all done live, or?
That's all live.
Okay.
Yeah, well, no, the sax was overdubbed.
Okay.
The live part, the percussion and me, guitar, vocal, and foot, and the added percussion was all done live. Or most of it was done live. A little bit, there's one or two cymbal hits that I think were overdubbed.
Yeah.
But the live session has no metal in it at all. It's just drums.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And that's Zach Trajano. He hates metal. He likes to sit there and pound on things, you know, that make thumping noises. He doesn't like it.
Well, it's tricky with finger style guitar stuff to make a full drum kit work. You know, like it just steps on those frequencies that you need to have to yourself as a guitar player.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And Zach Trajano is a very, very good acoustic guitar player, and he understands that. But he was a drummer before he was a guitar player.
Okay, cool.
So, you know, you put your finger on that aspect of it. Yeah, so we did those live, and then I think just 2 days before we went in to start the sessions, Goody said, he called me up. He says, Chris, how would you like to have a world-class sax player on your record? And I said, and I've learned not to dismiss any suggestions.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes they don't work, but, you know, you don't say no. You know? I said, who is it? And he says, Chris Cheek. And I said, am I supposed to know who Chris Cheek is? And he says, yes, you are. He is one of the 3 best in the whole world. And he was a gem.
Okay.
I mean, he was just, I came in, he spent one medium long afternoon with us, maybe 4 hours. He worked on those 4 tunes.
Yeah.
And
it's a real statement. Like it's a real, notice it, but it's not like super
he comes in and he says, what's the first one? And it was all about the bones, and so he listens to it through and he said, okay, that's cool. He walks in the other room and we're all just sitting in the control room with our jaws are on the floor.
Yeah.
he says, play it for me again. And so he listened to it through and then he says, okay, put it up. And he puts it up and he starts to play. And we were just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
he comes back in to hear what it sounded like. And we were effusive, of course. And he listened to it and he said, you like that? And we said, yeah. He says, I could do better. We said, well, go do better. And he did.
Wow.
He walked in the other room and the rest of them were pretty much first take.
So were you, like, when you recorded the tracks, were you picturing having another instrument or a sax or anything, or were you not consciously leaving space for that?
I did not consciously leave space for it at all. Basically, Goody's philosophy is he puts me at the center of things, and then he puts things around me, and then he starts peeling them off like an onion until it's down to what he wants, to what he hears. And I mean, he consults with me. He says, here's what I want to do, but basically his concept of what what a Chris Miller record should sound like, it hasn't changed much. Mm-hmm. He says, you're at the center of things and I want things around that will augment it. Yeah. But I don't want anybody stepping on you.
Yeah. And Betty Sue, same kind of thing. Like, did she come in after the fact and sang?
She came in. Well, yeah, she came. I had met her several times, and she'd opened sets for me. Uh-huh. And I'd heard her with James McMurtry as well. She did a lot of work with him. And I knew that she could sing harmony because I'd heard her with a trio. There was a woman's trio with 3 women singing, and I knew that she was a good harmony singer and an instinctive one. But I didn't quite expect what I got, and that was another surprise, like Chris Cheek. She's got a facility for intimacy that.
Yeah, she's whispering those harmonies sometimes.
I know, and it is.
Nobody does that.
Breathtaking.
Yeah.
It's so integral. It's almost like I've said before. I was told somebody that it's like she climbs inside your shirt and just lives there. It's wonderful. Yeah. Plus, she's a kick to be with. She's a lot of fun.
Well, yeah, I've done a little bit of recording with her, and So, what's next for you? Do you have plans to make another record at this point, or?
I don't know, Steve. Okay. I hate to even. I don't want to cause expectation. I don't want to generate expectations. I'm still. This record's been very well received, and I'm just happy to still be doing what I'm doing, and I'm out there having fun playing.
Do you still tour as much as you want to be touring? Like, where is that at with you? I know, in speaking with John, who's maybe a little older than you, but he's basically like stopped gigging at this point. John Hammond, that is. Like, do you see yourself wanting to not tour? Like, you seem very young and sprightly, and to me,
I'm lucky. I'm healthy, and I'm happy when I'm working.
Okay.
COVID taught me a couple of things. It taught me, number one, that I could retire if I wanted to. Mm-hmm. And the second thing it taught me was I didn't want to.
So you're happy being out there and doing it.
The travel's harder than it used to be. Yeah. It's just more difficult and more wearing, but at the same time, I travel more comfortably than I used to. Mm-hmm. And the gigs are nicer. They're better places. I'm taken care of. So it's not that much of a stretch. I've worked very hard since this record came out. By the end of the year, I probably will have done close to 100 shows. But it's and that's a little stiff. But I think for the foreseeable future, I can still be up there in this 60 to 80 gigs 80 gigs a year range and be pretty comfortable.
Yeah. Just need to get Bonnie Raitt to do another cover of one of your tunes and then just retire.
She can do what she wants. As far as I'm concerned, she has been the most loyal of friends to me.
Yeah. Do you keep in touch with her, obviously?
Yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for hanging out and talking to me today. And this has been fascinating hearing all your stories. And, I think what you do is so unique and interesting. And I'm glad that you're so into it still and that there's probably more coming. I think that's
I've enjoyed
awesome.
talking to you, and I've enjoyed hearing you talk to other people.
I appreciate that that's cool. Like, when we met at the Vancouver Folk Fest. I think I've met you before, actually. I don't really remember where it would have been, but
I thought that was the first time. But we have a mutual friend, Randy Fradkin.
Yeah, I did a bunch of touring with Kelly Jo Phelps, and I feel like we did. I feel like we did a couple dates with you at some point back.
That's a possibility. That could be, and that would have been long enough ago that it would have faded. But At any rate, no, I Randy turned me on to your stuff, and I was the first one I heard was Peter Case, and he's an old friend.
Oh, cool.
So that was a great one. That
was a trip. Yeah, I love that one. Yeah. Yeah. All right, man. Well, thanks so much, and I hope to see you out there at a festival or something one of these days.
Well, I have a feeling that we'll see each other fairly often, actually, from here on out.
I think so, too. Right on. All right. Thanks, Chris.
Take care.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Music Makers and Soul Shakers is a bi-weekly podcast produced at the Hen House Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. You can also find us at makersandshakerspodcast.com. Thanks again to our sponsors this season, Larrivee Guitars, Fishman Pickups, Chase Bliss Pedals, Union Tube and Transistor, Spectra 1964, and the Hen House Hang. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.